Frank Zappa was never predictable, not in his music, not in his interviews, and certainly not in his opinions. He challenged genres, mocked commercial expectations, and built a career on being one of the most unapologetically original minds in modern music. But throughout his decades of fearless experimentation, one question followed him everywhere: who inspired Frank Zappa? Fans argued endlessly. Critics speculated. Musicians guessed. But Zappa rarely answered directly. He preferred complexity over simplicity, ideas over lists, and exploration over tradition. That's why, when he finally opened up about the artists who shaped him, the musicians he genuinely admired, the revelation stunned almost everyone. What he revealed wasn't a predictable collection of rock icons or mainstream legends. Instead, it was a list that reflected Zappa's brain: bold, surprising, relentlessly curious, and fiercely honest. The choices exposed the foundation of his musical genius, the rhythmic DNA behind his most experimental compositions, and the unexpected influences that pushed him to keep reinventing sound itself. This wasn't just a list of favorites. It was a window into the mind of one of the most complex artists of the 20th century. Some of the names he revealed were innovators long before their time. Others were classical giants. A few were musicians the public barely knew, yet Zappa considered them geniuses. Together, they formed a portrait, a map of the artistic forces that shaped a man who refused to be shaped by anyone. For the first time, we can explore exactly who Frank Zappa admired, and why their music meant so much to him. Frank Zappa never cared about being liked. He cared about being original. While other musicians spent their careers chasing trends, Zappa spent his chasing sounds, unusual sounds, disobedient sounds, sounds no one else could hear until he showed them the possibilities. That's why the question, "Who inspired you?" always irritated him. He believed artists should be their own source. Yet beneath his sharp wit and refusal to follow the herd, there were musicians he quietly admired, musicians whose influence seeped into his work, shaping his fearless approach long before he became the icon the world now remembers. The story begins in Zappa's childhood bedroom, where a teenage Frank discovered an album that would alter the course of his life, Edgar Varèse's The Complete Works, Volume 1. Zappa later said Varèse's music hit me like a bolt of lightning. At a time when kids were obsessed with Elvis, young Frank was obsessed with sirens, dissonance, and experimental percussion. Varèse became the cornerstone of Zappa's artistic DNA. But Varèse wasn't alone in that foundation. Igor Stravinsky's explosive orchestral style became another pillar of Zappa's imagination. He admired Stravinsky not because the music was beautiful, but because it was brave. Zappa saw courage in those chaotic rhythms, a kind of discipline within madness that mirrored what he would later create with the mothers of invention. Jazz musicians shaped him too. Eric Dolphy, Thelonious Monk, and Johnny "Guitar" Watson all contributed colors to Zappa's palette. Dolphy's unpredictability, Monk's angular logic, and Watson's swaggering blues taught Zappa the value of personality in music, the idea that every note must sound like nobody else could have played it. His admiration for classical innovators like Anton Webern and Pierre Boulez came from their mathematical precision. Webern's tight, crystalline structures fascinated Zappa, while Boulez eventually collaborated directly with him, validating Zappa's belief that rock and classical music didn't need to live in separate universes. Then there was Captain Beefheart, Zappa's childhood friend, rival, collaborator, and creative lightning rod. Beefheart's raw, untamed voice and surreal lyrics challenged Zappa in ways few others could. Their relationship was complicated, often stormy, but rooted in mutual respect. The final influence came from beyond the Western world. Ali Akbar Khan introduced Zappa to modal improvisation and the emotional depth of Indian classical music. It pushed him further away from traditional American patterns and into a global musical mindset. Each of these musicians fed a different part of Zappa's imagination. And together, they formed a list that was never about popularity, but about innovation, about the kind of artists who tear down walls instead of decorating them. Zappa didn't admire musicians because they were famous. He admired them because they were fearless. Frank Zappa didn't just like these musicians, he studied them, absorbed them, and folded their ideas into his own musical DNA. To understand why these 10 names mattered so deeply to him, you have to understand what Zappa valued most: originality, courage, and the refusal to follow tradition. Every musician on his list embodied those qualities in their own way. Take Edgar Varèse, the avant-garde giant whose work shattered the limits of what music could be. For Zappa, Varèse wasn't just a composer, he was a revolutionary. Varèse proved that sound itself could be art, whether it came from violins, drums, or electronic tone generators. Zappa built his early identity around that revelation. He used Varèse's approach to justify the experimentation that would become his signature. Then there was Igor Stravinsky, whose bold rhythmic patterns hit Zappa like a shockwave. Stravinsky didn't care if his music was beautiful, he cared if it was alive. Zappa admired that. He once said Stravinsky taught him that ugly can be beautiful if it's honest. That philosophy became a guiding rule for Zappa's own compositions. Zappa's love for jazz innovators came from their unpredictability. Eric Dolphy, with his spiraling saxophone runs, taught Zappa that chaos could be controlled. Thelonious Monk, with his deliberate, wrong notes, showed him that mistakes could be intentional, if they carried meaning. And Johnny "Guitar" Watson, the bluesman Zappa adored, gave him swagger, groove, and the ability to blend humor with musicianship. Watson's influence can be heard all over Zappa's guitar work. Blues legend Gatemouth Brown added another layer: emotion. Zappa admired musicians who played with personality, and Gatemouth had that in abundance. His hybrid style, blues, swing, country, and jazz, aligned perfectly with Zappa's belief that music shouldn't be trapped by labels. Zappa's fascination with Anton Webern and Pierre Boulez came from their strictness. Webern's microscopic precision, the ability to compose complex ideas in just a few minutes, showed Zappa that density could be elegant. Boulez, on the other hand, validated him on a personal level. When Boulez agreed to conduct Zappa's work, it proved that Zappa's compositions weren't just rock experiments, they were serious, even academically respected. And then there was Captain Beefheart. Their relationship was messy. It was emotional. It was brilliant and volatile. But Zappa always respected Beefheart's raw, unfiltered creativity. Beefheart wrote as if he existed in a different dimension, and even when the two clashed, Zappa saw the genius behind the madness. Few people challenged him artistically the way Beefheart did. Finally, Ali Akbar Khan expanded Zappa's musical world beyond Western structure. Indian classical music introduced him to drones, emotional phrasing, and modal improvisation. These influences often surfaced subtly, buried inside guitar solos, rhythmic cycles, or orchestral pieces, but they were always there, shaping the way he thought about melody. The common thread between all 10 musicians is simple. They were fearless thinkers. They didn't create music to please audiences. They created music to explore ideas. And for a man like Zappa, who spent his entire life refusing to be ordinary, these artists represented everything he believed music should be: brave, strange, challenging, and unapologetically unique. Frank Zappa's list of his 10 favorite musicians wasn't just a collection of names, it was a decoding key to understanding his own artistic DNA. Every musician he admired contributed something to the way he approached music, philosophy, and performance. And if explored the artists themselves, dives into why Zappa connected with them, what they inspired in him, and how each one shaped pieces of the genius we remember today. To understand Zappa's taste, you first have to understand Zappa himself. He was a man who believed in absolute musical freedom, no boundaries, no categories, no rules. Rock could sit next to classical. Jazz could coexist with satire. Avant-garde noise could mingle with poetic beauty. For Zappa, music wasn't a box, it was a universe. And the musicians he admired all came from that same fearless universe. Take Edgar Varèse, for example. Varèse's approach to music as organized sound gave Zappa permission to experiment, to break form, and to treat the studio like a laboratory. When Zappa said, "The present-day composer refuses to die," he wasn't just quoting Varèse, he was declaring his own mission statement. Varèse planted the idea that music should challenge, disturb, and expand. Then there were his jazz heroes, Eric Dolphy, Charles Mingus, and Sun Ra, musicians who played like the rules never existed. Their improvisation wasn't chaos, it was discipline wrapped in unpredictability. Zappa internalized that. His guitar solos, band arrangements, and controlled accidents on stage were shaped by the idea that freedom could be structured, and structure could feel free. Zappa also gravitated toward musicians with character, artists who stood apart from the mainstream without apology. Captain Beefheart, for example, wasn't just a collaborator, he was a mirror of Zappa's own refusal to blend in. Beefheart's raw vocal power and surreal lyricism inspired Zappa to push his own creativity further into the strange, the humorous, and the unconventional. Even his rock inspirations were chosen for their uniqueness, not their fame. Jimi Hendrix represented pure, explosive innovation. Ry Cooder embodied mastery of feel and tone. Johnny "Guitar" Watson brought swagger, soul, and effortless cool. These weren't just musicians, they were characters, forces, energies. But the most unexpected name, Igor Stravinsky, may be the key to understanding Zappa above all. Stravinsky was fearless, blending rhythm, chaos, and orchestral brilliance into something the world had never heard before. Zappa didn't just admire him, he borrowed from him. You can hear Stravinsky's fingerprints in Zappa's abrupt time changes, orchestral pieces, and even the comedic tension in his rock albums. What ties all these musicians together? Not genre. Not era. Not style. Courage. Individuality. A refusal to conform. That is what Zappa valued. That is what he channeled. And perhaps the most revealing detail is this: every musician on the list was someone who created for the sake of creation, not for popularity, not for approval, not for commercial safety. These were artists who were willing to confuse people, shock people, even alienate people, if it meant making something real. Zappa loved that. Zappa lived that. Zappa was that. His list wasn't just a tribute. It was a blueprint of the fearless innovators who shaped his identity, and, through him, reshaped the possibilities of American music. Frank Zappa's admiration for these 10 musicians wasn't just nostalgia or casual fandom. It was a living blueprint, a set of guiding principles that shaped how he created music, led his bands, and even approached life. Explores how Zappa transformed inspiration into legacy, and why understanding his favorites gives us a window into the mind of one of the most original artists of the 20th century. Zappa was meticulous. He dissected, studied, and absorbed the techniques of each musician he admired. With Edgar Varèse, he learned to think of sound as architecture, to approach composition with an engineer's eye while maintaining a rebel spirit. With Stravinsky, he embraced the thrill of dissonance, sudden shifts, and rhythmic complexity, proving that music could surprise, challenge, and even shock listeners. These lessons weren't theoretical, they appeared in albums like Uncle Meat and The Grand Wazoo, where orchestration, rhythm, and humor collide in ways no one else could replicate. Jazz influences, Dolphy, Monk, Watson, and Gatemouth Brown, taught Zappa about individuality. Improvisation became a language he spoke fluently. Every note, every silence, every microgesture in his performances carried personality. Zappa's guitar solos weren't just technical, they were storytelling, infused with the same spontaneity he admired in his jazz heroes. The subtle blues inflections of Johnny "Guitar" Watson, the raw emotional honesty of Gatemouth Brown, these shaped the color and texture of Zappa's sound, bridging the gap between intellect and emotion. Zappa's fascination with classical innovators like Webern and Boulez added discipline to the chaos. He learned that rules could be instruments themselves, structures could frame freedom rather than restrict it. And when he collaborated with Boulez, it validated Zappa's belief that rock, jazz, and classical weren't separate worlds, they were languages capable of conversation. Zappa carried that idea forward relentlessly, crafting albums that were at once humorous, technically complex, and emotionally resonant. Then there were the boundary breakers like Captain Beefheart and Beefheart's Raw. Surrealistic creativity challenged Zappa to explore absurdity and human psychology through sound. Khan's Indian classical mastery expanded Zappa's sense of melody, rhythm, and microtonal experimentation, giving him a global perspective that few rock musicians ever achieved. These influences weren't surface level, they shaped Zappa's philosophy that music should stretch beyond cultural, stylistic, and geographical boundaries. What emerges is a portrait of Zappa as both student and teacher. He took what he admired and transformed it into something entirely new, something uniquely his own. Every time a listener is stunned by a sudden time signature change, a bizarre orchestral passage, or a perfectly executed satirical lyric, they are hearing the echoes of his heroes filtered through Zappa's genius. His favorites weren't just idols, they were co-conspirators in the creation of his musical universe. Finally, Zappa's list reminds us of a simple truth: artistry is about fearlessness. Every musician on that list defied convention, embraced risk, and refused to play it safe. By venerating these innovators, Zappa reinforced the same standard for himself and for future generations: don't imitate, don't conform, don't compromise. Explore relentlessly. Create boldly. And always, always be true to your own voice. In the end, Frank Zappa's 10 favorite musicians weren't just a list, they were a manifesto. A declaration that music is infinite, influence is eternal, and the courage to innovate is the truest legacy an artist can leave behind. Through them, Zappa learned, evolved, and left the world a musical landscape forever expanded by his brilliance.